What's the most healing thing you've ever done for your inner child? My parents shamed my stutter that emerged after a fall, claiming I'd embarrassed their flawless reputation. My brother brushed off my struggle, and they silenced my voice. I rediscovered my words through a poetry workshop, enlisted a mentor to perform my verses, shared my rhymes at a local open mic, and spoke my truth freely, growing in my clarity while my parents hoard my childhood tapes, replaying the voice they once rejected. The silence arrived after the fall. I was 6, a fearless climber obsessed with the old oak tree in our garden. Its sturdy branches were my castle walls, my pirate ship deck. That afternoon, reaching for a higher branch, my foot slipped, tangled somehow in a loop of old rope swing someone had left tied up years ago. Instead of scrambling, I tumbled downwards, momentum flipping me awkwardly. There was a sickening lurch, a flash of green leaves rushing past, then a hard, jarring impact as my head struck the packed earth near the roots. A brief, blinding flash of pain exploded behind my eyes, followed by a wave of dizzying disorientation, then the inevitable tears. Physically, the damage was minor. Scraped elbows, a ringing headache, a spectacular bruise blooming on my forehead. But something inside, something delicate and crucial in the intricate wiring between thought and speech, had been irrevocably jarred, snapped loose by the impact. The words that came out afterward, after the initial shock subsided, were different, hesitant, fractured, stuck. Before the fall, I was chatterbox Maya. Words tumbled out of me easily, eagerly, a constant stream reflecting the busy world inside my head. I narrated my imaginary games, asked endless questions about clouds and bugs, sang wildly off-key psalms I made up on the spot. After the fall, silence became my unwilling refuge. Speaking, attempting to translate the clear thoughts in my head into audible sounds, felt like navigating a treacherous, invisible minefield. Simple, everyday sounds became insurmountable obstacles. M's and P's felt like running full tilt into a brick wall. The sound just wouldn't come out, locking my jaw in frustrating paralysis. S's, when they emerged at all, hissed uncontrollably, drawing unwanted attention. The harder I consciously tried to force a word out, the more tangled and distorted it became. The more my face flushed with heat, the more my throat tightened in a painful knot. The effortless flow was gone, replaced by a frustrating, unpredictable dam. My parents' reaction wasn't concern for the fall's potential neurological impact, but acute embarrassment. Their carefully constructed public image, the flawless family reputation they meticulously cultivated in our small, judgmental town, couldn't accommodate a child with a sudden, noticeable stutter. It was a flaw, an imperfection, a public display of something being wrong, something not measuring up to their exacting standards. Their initial response was a strained denial, hoping it was temporary. When it persisted, impatience set in. "Just slow down, Maya," Mom would say, her voice tight with poorly concealed annoyance, not sympathy. "Think before you speak. Take a breath." As if it were that simple, a matter of conscious control. Dad reacted differently. He would simply turn away when I struggled, pretending not to hear the halting sounds, or worse, he'd cut me off mid-sentence to finish my thought impatiently, silencing the stutter before it could fully manifest its awkward presence and, by extension, silencing me, erasing my attempt to communicate. My older brother, Ben, 2 years my senior, and already adept at navigating our parents' expectations, adopted a policy of pragmatic, benign neglect. My struggle was simply background noise to him, an inconvenient static that occasionally interfered with his own life. If my stutter interrupted his train of thought during homework, or delayed an answer he wanted from me, he'd let out an audible sigh, roll his eyes, or simply talk over me as if I hadn't been attempting to speak at all. There was no overt malice in his actions, just a complete, self-absorbed lack of interest or empathy. My problem wasn't his problem. It didn't affect his standing, so it didn't register. The shame, therefore, started early, planted by my parents' visible embarrassment and impatience, nurtured by my own mounting frustration and the sting of Ben's casual dismissal. School transformed from a place of discovery into a daily trial by potential humiliation. Reading aloud in class became a recurring nightmare, each assigned paragraph a looming sentence. Answering questions, even when I knew the answer, felt like volunteering for public mockery. I quickly learned avoidance tactics, feigning ignorance, mumbling non-committally, strategically letting other, more fluent students speak first. I became adept at rapid mental substitution, scanning ahead for treacherous words and swapping them for simpler, safer synonyms, even if those words diluted my meaning or made me sound less intelligent. My active vocabulary shrank. My class participation dwindled to near zero. I retreated inwards, constructing thick, silent walls around the words, the thoughts, the feelings trapped inside me. My parents, observing my withdrawal and continued disfluency, interpreted the stutter not as a potential neurological consequence of the head injury, but as a behavioral issue, a willful act of defiance, perhaps, or sheer laziness, or a lack of proper self-control. "You're simply not trying hard enough, Maya," Dad would insist sternly after a particularly difficult sentence at the dinner table, his disappointment palpable. "Concentrate, focus." Their attempts to fix the problem were misguided and actively damaging, born of their own embarrassment rather than any understanding of speech disorders. They deliberately forced me into high-pressure situations, guaranteed to trigger anxiety and exacerbate the stutter, making me the designated person to order for the whole family in noisy restaurants, insisting I give impromptu reports on books I'd read to their visiting friends or business associates. Each inevitable failure, each halting, fragmented sentence, each visible struggle for control was met with their barely concealed sighs, impatient frowns, sometimes even thinly veiled anger that flashed in their eyes. "You're embarrassing us, Maya," Mom hissed under her breath, once after I stumbled painfully over a simple thank you to a neighbor who had brought over cookies. The message, verbalized or not, was relentlessly clear. clear. My voice, in its current imperfect state, was unacceptable. It reflected poorly on them, tarnished their image. It needed to be controlled, hidden, or preferably eliminated entirely. They consented to speech therapy briefly, arranging a few sessions with a local therapist. However, they approached these sessions with the same underlying impatience and expectation of a quick fix. When progress wasn't instantaneous, when the therapist spoke gently of the need for patience, reducing pressure, building confidence, and accepting fluctuations, the exact opposite of their demanding, results-oriented approach, they quickly deemed the therapy ineffective, a waste of time and money, and pulled me out after only a handful of visits. Their preferred solution became simply to discourage me from speaking much at all, especially in public settings or around people whose opinions they valued. Silence was deemed preferable to imperfect speech. They became adept at filling the silence themselves, anticipating my needs, speaking for me, interpreting my gestures, finishing my sentences before I could even fully start them, effectively erasing my voice from the fabric of family life. Compounding this erasure, they kept old home videos, recordings from before the fall, from the era of Chatterbox Maya. Sometimes, during quiet evenings or holidays, Dad would set up the projector and they'd watch them, sighing wistfully. "Listen to that," he'd murmur as my 6-year-old self chattered away fluently, confidently on screen. "That's our Maya." Such a clear, bright little voice. The unspoken contrast hung heavy in the air, implicitly reinforcing that the current me, the stuttering me, was a profound disappointment, a flawed version of the child they preferred to remember. Living within that suffocating environment, my inner world paradoxically became richer, more complex, while my outer voice progressively withered. Thoughts, ideas, sharp observations, witty remarks, urgent questions, they all piled up inside, swirling in my mind, but finding no smooth, reliable path outward. Frustration festered, turning into a quiet, simmering anger, directed mostly at myself, at my treacherous tongue. The bright, curious 6-year-old who fell from the oak tree felt increasingly trapped, locked away inside the withdrawn teenager who couldn't reliably say her own name without tripping over the first consonant, who measured social interactions by the potential for verbal failure. The shame my parents projected, intentionally or not, became my own deeply ingrained internal reality. I believed, truly believed, that my voice was fundamentally broken, wrong, something defective to be hidden away at all costs. The shift, when it came, began subtly, unexpectedly, not through any conscious effort to fix myself, but through a chance discovery in a dusty, neglected corner of the school library during my junior year. Seeking refuge from the noisy cafeteria, I stumbled upon an anthology of modern poetry tucked away on a bottom shelf. Idly flipping through its pages, I landed on a poem by Patti Smith. Words that felt jagged, unconventional, raw, yet undeniably powerful. It wasn't about crafting smooth, elegant sentences. It was about conveying raw feeling, visceral experience, through rhythm, imagery, and startling honesty. Intrigued, I pulled the book down and started reading more. Poems about struggle, about silence, about anger, about finding unexpected beauty in things perceived as broken or flawed. Words on a page, I realized with a jolt, didn't stutter. They could be carefully chosen, meticulously arranged, rearranged, polished, until they shone, until they conveyed precisely what I meant, without the unpredictable betrayal of my own tongue. A new possibility opened. I started writing, tentatively at first, feeling almost illicit. Short, fragmented verses, raw bursts of feeling, jotted down in cheap spiral notebooks hidden under my mattress. The act of writing felt like slowly, carefully unlocking a pressure valve that had been tightened for a decade. The words, denied an easy exit through speech, flowed onto the page with a surprising fluency. I wrote about the sickening lurch of the fall from the tree, about the frustrating, invisible wall that slammed down mid-word, about the tightening in my throat that felt like strangulation, about my parents' disappointed sighs that echoed louder than shouts, about Ben's casual indifference that stung in its own way, about the constant, aching longing simply to be heard, to be understood. The notebooks filled rapidly with raw, unfiltered emotion, translated into metaphors, rhythms, line breaks. It became a secret language, a parallel existence where I could finally speak without impediment, without fear, without shame. For months, perhaps close to a year, writing remained a purely private act, a solitary refuge, a way to process the accumulated weight of silence and misunderstanding. The idea of sharing these intensely personal words, these confessions of vulnerability, felt terrifying, counterintuitive. It meant exposing the very weakness, the very flaw my family had implicitly and explicitly taught me to hide at all costs. But the silence, even with the partial release valve of writing, still felt heavy, incomplete. The poems existed, captured on paper, but they remained voiceless, trapped in the notebooks just as the spoken words were so often trapped behind my teeth. The act of creation felt good, necessary even, but the lack of communication, of connection, left a lingering ache. Then, pinned amidst the clutter of club announcements and tutoring schedules on the main library bulletin board, a simple flyer caught my eye. Community Poetry Workshop, Find Your Voice. The tagline felt like a direct, almost cosmic challenge. It felt like a sign, albeit a deeply intimidating one. The workshop, according to the flyer, was held Tuesday evenings at the local community arts center, led by a woman named Eleanor Evans, described as a retired English professor with extensive experience and a reputation for fostering a supportive environment for writers of all levels, particularly encouraging unconventional expression. Attending meant willingly stepping into a situation designed around verbal sharing. It meant risking exposure, risking the familiar humiliation of public disfluency, risking judgment from strangers. Yet, the deep-seated desire to connect with others who valued words, the nascent hope of finding a place where my written voice might be acknowledged, warred fiercely with the ingrained fear and the habit of hiding. Summoning every ounce of courage courage I possessed, fueled by a desperate, what have I got to lose mentality, I signed up online, paying the modest fee from my meager part-time job savings. The first session was sheer agony. Walking into the bright, airy room at the Art Center, seeing the circle of chairs already occupied by 8 unfamiliar faces, felt like walking onto a stage naked. The introductions were excruciating. Sitting in that circle, waiting for my turn, felt like waiting for a verdict. When it came, the M in Maya lodged itself firmly, stubbornly in my throat. Maya. The familiar hated flush surged up my neck. My eyes darted downwards. But Miss Evans, whose kind eyes held no trace of pity or impatience, simply smiled gently, thanked me by name, pronouncing it perfectly, and moved smoothly on to the next person. The other participants, a diverse mix of ages, backgrounds, and apparent confidence levels, seemed far more interested in the prospect of discussing poetry than in dissecting my delivery. A small knot of tension inside me eased, just slightly. Over the next few weeks, against all my initial fears, the Tuesday evening workshop became my sanctuary, the one place I felt I could breathe. We read an incredible range of poetry, classic sonnets, sprawling free verse, sharp haikus, angry spoken word pieces. We discussed metaphor, rhythm, voice, imagery. Miss Evans facilitated discussions with a light, expert touch, drawing out insights, encouraging different interpretations. And crucially, we shared our own writing. Sharing was always optional, presented as an opportunity, not an obligation. For the first month, maybe longer, I remained a listener. I absorbed the words of others, their vulnerability, their humor, their anger, their power. I heard stories of grief, love, political frustration, quiet joy, all expressed in myriad forms. Miss Evans fostered an atmosphere of profound acceptance, consistently emphasizing that poetry was about authentic expression, finding your unique voice, not achieving some arbitrary standard of perfect elocution or conventional form. Finally, one rainy Tuesday evening, fueled by a particularly resonant discussion about using poetry to reclaim narratives, to speak the unspeakable, I took the plunge. My hands shook uncontrollably as I unfolded a crumpled piece of paper retrieved from my bag. It contained a short, intensely personal poem I'd written about the physical sensation of words getting stuck, likening them to frantic birds beating against the bars of a cage in my throat. The thought of reading it aloud myself was still paralyzing, unthinkable. Instead, summoning my courage, I quietly asked Miss Evans, whose turn it was to share next, if she would consider reading my piece for the group instead. She agreed immediately, without hesitation, her expression conveying only gentle understanding. Hearing my own words, my deepest, most private feelings about the stutter, the shame, the frustration, read aloud in Miss Evans' clear, steady, empathetic voice was a revelation, an almost physical release. The other participants listened with focused intensity. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then, instead of the pity or awkwardness I had braced for, there were nods of understanding, murmurs of appreciation for the imagery, the raw honesty. Someone commented on the visceral power of the caged bird metaphor. Someone else shared a brief related struggle with performance anxiety that made me feel instantly less alone. For the very first time, my internal world, the thoughts I had confined to secret notebooks, had been given external voice, shared with others, and accepted, validated, not judged or shamed. It felt profoundly, fundamentally healing, like sunlight reaching a part of me that had been in darkness for a decade. This became my established method, my bridge across the silence. I wrote prolifically now, the validation from the workshop acting as fuel. Years of suppressed thoughts, feelings, observations poured onto the page with newfound urgency. And each week at the workshop, I would select a piece and ask Miss Evans, or occasionally another participant I grew to trust implicitly, like old Mr. Roth Henderson, no relation to the neighbor, who wrote poignant poems about his garden, or Sarah, a quiet woman who wrote fierce political verse, to read my work aloud for me. Each reading felt like another layer of shame being carefully peeled away, replaced by a tentative, growing sense of validation, of belonging. My voice, albeit filtered through the kindness of others, was being heard, acknowledged, even appreciated. Miss Evans evolved naturally from workshop facilitator into a true mentor. She possessed the rare gift of seeing the writer behind the speech impediment, recognizing the strength, clarity, and unique perspective in my written words, even when I couldn't yet voice them myself. She encouraged me gently, consistently, never pushing me to speak before I felt ready, but always celebrating the power and potential of my writing. We fell into a routine of meeting briefly after the formal workshop sessions ended, discussing my latest poems. Her feedback was always insightful, focused entirely on craft, strengthening a metaphor, refining rhythm, clarifying an image, never once mentioning or alluding to my speech difficulty. She loaned me books from her personal library, introducing me to poets who explored themes of silence, voice, trauma, and resilience. Writers like Sharon Olds, Ocean Vuong, Ada Limon. She saw potential where my family saw only flawed delivery, a defect to be managed or hidden. Your words have real power, Maya, she told me earnestly one evening, holding a poem I'd written about my parents' nostalgic obsession with the old home videos. They capture something raw and true. They deserve to be heard more widely than just in this room. The idea simultaneously terrified and intrigued me. More widely? Where? How could that be possible? Miss Evans suggested the local monthly open mic night held at the Daily Grind, a popular downtown coffee shop known for its supportive arts scene. You don't have to read yourself. Not yet, she added quickly, accurately reading the flicker of panic in my eyes. Perhaps I could read a piece or two for you initially, or maybe Sarah, or Mr. Henderson, just to get your words out there, into the community. The open mic night felt like scaling a sheer cliff face compared to the gentle incline of the workshop. It wasn't the safe, nurturing cocoon I had come to rely on. It was public, unpredictable, filled with strangers. But the thought of my words, my carefully crafted expressions of a long-silenced experience, reaching a wider audience, potentially resonating with others who felt unheard. It was a compelling, magnetic pull. I spent the next few weeks agonizing over poem selection, eventually choosing 3 pieces that felt like they told a coherent, representative arc of my journey. One capturing the initial shock and silencing after the fall, one exploring the intense frustration of trapped words, caged birds, and one expressing the tentative hope and refuge I had discovered through writing. With deep gratitude and considerable nervousness, I asked Miss Evans if she would be willing to be my voice at the upcoming open mic. She readily, graciously agreed, understanding the significance of this step for me. We met several times to practice, not my speech, of course, but her interpretation of the poems. I'd read them silently to myself while she read them aloud, stopping her occasionally to discuss a particular line break, a desired emphasis, ensuring she captured the precise rhythm, the intended emotional weight. Her willingness to lend me her voice, her clarity, without a trace of judgment or pity, felt like an extraordinary, generous gift, a true act of mentorship. The night of the open mic arrived, fraught with anticipation. The daily grind was dimly lit, packed with people, buzzing with the nervous energy of performers and the supportive hum of the audience. My heart pounded relentlessly against my ribs. Finding a seat in the darkest corner, as far from the small makeshift stage as possible, I felt intensely vulnerable, exposed, like my secret self was about to be put on public display. When the host, a cheerful local musician named Leo, eventually called Miss Evans to the stage, mentioning casually that she would be reading poems by a promising new local writer discovering their voice, I physically gripped the edge of my chair to keep from bolting out the door. Miss Evans stood calmly at the microphone, radiating a quiet confidence that I envied. She introduced the set simply, stating the poems explored themes of voice, silence, and finding expression. Then she began to read the first poem, the one about the fall and the subsequent silencing. Hearing my words fill the crowded room, spoken with such clarity, nuance, and conviction by her resonant voice, was utterly surreal. I watched the audience. People leaned in, their expressions attentive. The poem about the caged birds seemed to resonate deeply. I saw heads nodding in understanding, empathetic winces. The poem about parental disappointment, about the corrosive effect of being told to speak clearly or not speak at all, drew quiet murmurs of sympathy, a few knowing glances exchanged between listeners. The final poem, the one about finding refuge and power in written language, ended the set on a note of quiet, determined hope. When Miss Evans finished, a profound silence held the room for a beat, then erupted into applause. Warm, genuine, sustained applause. It felt directed not just at Miss Evans's excellent reading, but at the words themselves. Several people approached her afterward as she stepped down, praising the honesty, the vivid imagery, the emotional depth. A couple even specifically asked about the author, eager to know more. Miss Evans deflected gracefully, protecting my anonymity as we had agreed, but she made sure to find me in my corner afterwards, relaying their positive comments, her eyes shining with shared pride. Sitting there, unseen, unheard, in my own physical voice, I felt an overwhelming, paradoxical sense of connection, of being truly seen. My truth, spoken through another's voice, had landed. It had been received. It mattered. That night marked a significant turning point, a seismic shift in my internal landscape. The external validation was intoxicating, potent. It wasn't a cure for the stutter, which remained a physical reality, but it acted as a powerful antidote to the deeply ingrained shame that had poisoned my relationship with my own voice for so long. It sparked a new, insistent desire to reclaim my own voice, not just metaphorically on the page, but literally, aloud, in public. The journey towards that goal was slow, arduous, painstaking. Encouraged and patiently guided by Miss Evans, I started incredibly small, within the continued safety of the weekly workshop. First, just reading the title of my poem aloud after she or someone else had read the body of the work. Then, graduating to reading a single line myself, usually the last line. Then, attempting a full stanza. Each tiny step felt monumental, fraught with anticipatory anxiety. Sometimes the words emerged relatively smoothly, buoyed by the supportive atmosphere. Other times, inevitably, the old blocks returned, the frustrating, involuntary, stuttering that made my cheeks burn with familiar heat. But the crucial difference now was the reception. No impatient sighs, no averted gazes, no finishing my sentences for me, just quiet encouragement, patient waiting, attentive listening focused on the words themselves, not the occasional struggle to articulate them. Miss Evans continued to work with me privately, teaching me breathing techniques, mindfulness strategies, not aimed at eliminating the stutter, which she stressed wasn't the goal, but at managing the anxiety around it, at accepting the moments of disfluency without letting them derail me or silence me completely. It was about finding fluency in expressing myself, even if the speech itself wasn't always fluent. It took many months of these incremental steps, months of deliberately exposing myself to the discomfort of my own imperfect speech within that supportive environment, building tolerance, chipping away at the fear. The desire to speak my own poems at the open mic night grew steadily stronger, becoming a focal point, a tangible goal representing ultimate reclamation. Miss Evans continued to read for me most months, generously acting as my proxy, inadvertently building a small, intrigued following for the anonymous poet whose work resonated with many regulars. But I knew, and she knew, that the next essential step in my healing journey was to stand at that microphone myself, under my own name. The first time I gathered the courage to sign up on the open mic list as Maya A, I felt physically ill with nerves for days beforehand. I chose my shortest, simplest, least emotionally fraught poem, one I had practiced reading aloud countless times in the privacy of my room. Waiting for my turn that night felt like an eternity trapped in a bubble of escalating panic. My palms sweated profusely, my throat felt felt like it was closing up. My heart hammered against my ribs like one of those caged birds from my poem. When the host, Leo, finally called my name, "All right, let's hear it for Maya A." The sound seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in the suddenly silent room. I walked towards the small stage on legs that felt like disconnected stilts. The single spotlight felt blindingly hot, accusatory. I gripped the microphone stand as if it were a life raft, unfolding the small piece of paper containing my poem with hands that visibly shook. Looking out at the sea of expectant faces, blurred by the spotlight's glare, the old panic surged, threatening to overwhelm me. I opened my mouth to speak my name, to introduce the poem. Nothing came out. Complete silence stretched, amplifying my internal terror. I could feel the familiar, hated flush creeping hotly up my neck. The urge to turn and run, to flee the stage, was almost overpowering. Then my eyes found Miss Evans, sitting near the front, her expression calm, her gaze steady, giving me the smallest, almost imperceptible, encouraging nod. I clung to that image. I took a deep, deliberate breath, consciously relaxing my jaw, remembering the techniques she had taught me. I started again. TT today. The first word snagged, a familiar block. But this time, instead of freezing, I pushed through it, accepting the imperfection. The poem was short, maybe 10 lines, about the feeling of spring arriving after a long winter. I stumbled over several words. My voice shook noticeably. It wasn't smooth, wasn't polished, wasn't the fluent performance I might have dreamed of, but it was mine. My voice, speaking my words. When I finished, breathless, heart pounding like a drum, there was a beat of profound silence, and then applause. Louder, warmer, more sustained than I could have ever dared to imagine. It wasn't polite applause. It felt genuine, appreciative. It wasn't applause for a perfect delivery. It was applause for the courage of showing up, for the raw vulnerability of the act, for the simple truth of the words themselves. That first solo reading didn't magically cure my stutter. I still stutter today, especially when I'm tired, stressed, or particularly anxious. The neurological wiring, perhaps jarred loose by the fall from the tree all those years ago, remains complex. But that night fundamentally shifted my relationship with my voice and with myself. Standing on that small stage, speaking my truth in my own authentic, imperfect way, and receiving not judgment or pity, but acceptance and warmth. It was the most profoundly healing, liberating act I could have possibly undertaken for the silenced, ashamed 6-year-old girl still living inside me. I had reclaimed my right to speak, stutter and all. I became a regular presence at the open mic nights after that breakthrough. Some nights, the words flowed more easily. Other nights, the familiar struggle returned, requiring more conscious effort, more deep breaths. But I always spoke. Each time felt like strengthening a newly exercised muscle. My confidence grew, slowly but steadily, spilling over into other areas of my daily life. I stopped dreading the telephone, initiating calls myself instead of relying on texts or emails. I began, tentatively at first, to participate more in class discussions, offering opinions, asking questions, even when my voice hitched or snagged. I gradually stopped feeling the constant, exhausting need to mentally scan ahead and substitute words, allowing myself the occasional moments of disfluency without the crushing, paralyzing weight of shame that had burdened me for so long. I was finding my voice, not just in the controlled environment of poetry readings, but in the messy, unpredictable flow of everyday life. My family's reaction to this gradual but significant transformation was complicated and ultimately disappointing. News of my increasingly frequent and confident public poetry performances inevitably reached them through the efficient grapevine of small-town gossip. Their response wasn't pride or even curiosity, but a strange, unsettling mixture of disbelief and palpable discomfort. This emerging Maya, the one who spoke publicly despite her difficulty, the one who wrote raw, honest poems about her experiences, including, presumably, her experiences within the family, didn't align with their preferred narrative. She wasn't the perfectly articulate daughter of their cherished home videos, nor was she the silenced, compliant version they had unconsciously cultivated over the years. My reclaiming my voice felt somehow like another form of rebellion against their expectations. Mom confronted me awkwardly one afternoon, catching me alone in the kitchen. Someone mentioned, "Helen from the book club saw you reading your poems in public at that coffee shop." Her tone was hesitant, uncertain, but laced with an undercurrent of disapproval. "Is that wise, Maya, given your particular difficulty?" "It helps me, Mom," I replied, keeping my voice steady, refusing to be drawn back into the old shame. "It feels good. But what exactly do you write about?" she pressed, her eyes searching mine, clearly fishing for reassurance that I wasn't betraying family secrets. "My life," I answered simply. "My experiences, my feelings." Her frown deepened, lines of worry etching themselves around her mouth. "Well, I certainly hope you're not airing dirty laundry, as they say. Some things are private, Maya. Family matters." The implication was crystal clear. My struggle, their reaction to it, the years of silencing, these were private family matters, not suitable for public consumption or artistic expression. My speaking my truth, even obliquely through poetry, was perceived as another form of embarrassing them, of tarnishing their precious reputation. They never attended an open mic night, despite knowing I performed regularly. They never asked to read my poems, never expressed curiosity about the writing that had become so central to my life and healing. Instead, they clung fiercely to the past, to the artifact of the voice they preferred. On holidays or quiet Sunday evenings, Dad would sometimes still pull out the old projector and screen the home movies from my early childhood, from before the fall. "Listen to that," he'd say wistfully, his voice tinged with sadness, as my 6-year-old self chattered away fluently, confidently on the flickering screen. "That's our Maya." Such a clear, bright little voice she had. They preferred the recording of the voice they hadn't shamed into silence, the echo of the perfect child they felt they had lost, over the real, living, breathing, occasionally stuttering, but finally finally free and authentic voice of the young woman sitting right there beside them. Their inability, or perhaps unwillingness, to accept my journey, to embrace my voice as it is now, complete with its imperfections, still evokes a pang of sadness. It's a constant, quiet reminder of the original wound they inflicted, the pervasive shame they cultivated, intentionally or not. But I came to understand, slowly, painfully, that the healing wasn't about changing them or forcing their acceptance. It was about changing my own relationship with myself, with my voice. It was about finding the words, first on the silent page, then amplifying them through the voice of a trusted mentor, and finally, claiming the right to speak them myself, stutter and all, in front of that coffee shop microphone and beyond. Rediscovering and reclaiming my voice, refusing to be silenced any longer by external judgment or internal shame. That was the most profoundly healing gift I could ever give to my inner child. The little girl who fell from the oak tree and was subsequently told her words, her very essence, were no longer acceptable. She and I are finally, irrevocably free to speak.